The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of Denver as Marcus Rodriguez crouched behind an overturned delivery truck, his weathered hands gripping a makeshift spear fashioned from a broken mop handle and kitchen knife. 3 months had passed since the outbreak began, and the once thriving city had become a graveyard of twisted metal and broken dreams. The air hung thick with the stench of decay, a constant reminder of how quickly civilization had crumbled when the dead refused to stay buried. Marcus had been a construction foreman before the world ended, his days filled with blueprints and building schedules. Now his expertise lay in identifying which structures could provide adequate shelter and which streets offered the best escape routes when the undead came shambling through in their relentless pursuit of flesh. His calloused fingers traced the edge of his weapon as he watched a small herd of zombies stumble past his hiding spot, their vacant eyes scanning for any sign of life. Behind him, pressed against the truck's cargo door, Rebecca Thompson clutched her infant daughter Emma to her chest. The baby had learned not to cry during these tense moments, as if she somehow understood that silence meant survival. Rebecca's auburn hair was matted with sweat and grime, her once pristine nurse's uniform now torn and stained with the harsh realities of their new existence. She had delivered babies and saved lives in the hospital's emergency room, but nothing had prepared her for keeping her own child alive in a world where death walked freely among the living. "How many?" she whispered, her breath barely audible over the distant moans echoing through the empty streets. Marcus held up 3 fingers, then slowly raised a fourth as another zombie dragged itself around the corner, its leg twisted at an impossible angle from some long-forgotten injury. The creature's hospital gown suggested it had been a patient when the infection spread through the medical facilities like wildfire, turning places of healing into breeding grounds for horror. Across the street, movement caught Marcus's attention. A figure darted between the skeletal remains of what had once been a coffee shop, moving with the practiced stealth of someone who had learned to survive in this nightmare landscape. The person wore a faded military jacket and carried a crossbow, suggesting they might be worth approaching for potential alliance or trade. As the zombie herd shuffled past, Marcus made his decision. Survival meant taking calculated risks, and isolation had proven to be just as deadly as exposure to the infected. He had watched too many lone survivors succumb to despair or make fatal mistakes that could have been avoided with backup. The construction site where he and Rebecca had been hiding was running low on supplies, and Emma needed formula that wouldn't be found among the scattered tools and concrete mix. The last zombie disappeared around the corner, its dragging footsteps fading into the ambient sounds of urban decay. Marcus signaled to Rebecca, who carefully adjusted Emma in her arms before following him as they emerged from their hiding spot. The mysterious figure across the street had vanished, but Marcus had noted the direction and hoped they might cross paths again under better circumstances. They moved quickly but quietly through the debris-strewn intersection, stepping over abandoned vehicles and scattered belongings that told the story of a mass evacuation gone wrong. A child's bicycle lay on its side next to a suitcase that had burst open, spilling clothes and family photographs across the asphalt like confetti celebrating the end of normalcy. As they navigated through the urban wasteland, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Not by zombies, whose attention was usually obvious and immediate, but by other survivors who had learned to observe before making contact. The balance between caution and desperation had become a delicate dance that determined who lived to see another sunrise and who became just another cautionary tale whispered around hidden campfires. Rebecca stumbled slightly, catching herself against a lamp post as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her maternal instincts. She had been running on adrenaline and determination for weeks, but even the strongest will had limits. Emma stirred in her arms, and for a moment, the baby's eyes opened to reveal the bright blue irises that reminded Rebecca of her late husband, who had died defending the hospital during the initial outbreak. The distant sound of breaking glass made them both freeze. Marcus raised his spear, scanning the surrounding buildings for signs of threat or opportunity. In this new world, the difference between salvation and destruction often came down to split-second decisions and the courage to act when action seemed impossible. As another crash echoed through the empty streets, followed by what sounded suspiciously like human voices, Marcus knew their period of relative safety was about to end. The real test of their survival was just beginning. The abandoned Jefferson Elementary School stood like a fortress against the chaos that had consumed the city, its red brick walls still intact despite the boarded windows and graffitied warnings spray-painted across its entrance. Marcus pushed open the heavy metal door carefully, his makeshift spear ready as Rebecca followed close behind with Emma pressed against her shoulder. The hallway stretched before them in eerie silence, children's artwork still clinging to bulletin boards like ghosts of a world that no longer existed. "This place gives me the creeps," Rebecca whispered, stepping over scattered crayons and torn pages from picture books. The normalcy of the school supplies felt more unsettling than the zombie-infested streets outside, a stark reminder of how quickly innocence had been stripped away from their reality. Marcus nodded, but his attention was focused on the subtle signs that suggested they weren't alone. Fresh footprints in the dust, recently moved furniture barricading certain doorways, and the faint smell of wood smoke that couldn't be explained by the building's heating system. Someone had made this place a temporary home, and Marcus wasn't sure if that made them safer or put them in greater danger. A door slammed somewhere deeper in the building, followed by urgent whispers and the scraping of furniture being moved. Marcus motioned for Rebecca to stay back as he approached the sound, his construction-trained ears picking up the deliberate movements of people trying to remain hidden. The whispers grew louder, revealing at least 3 distinct voices engaged in what sounded like a heated argument. "I'm telling you, we can't trust anyone who just walks in here," a woman's voice hissed through the walls. "How do we know they're not raiders or worse?" "Because raiders don't travel with babies," came the reply from a man with a slight southern accent. "Look, Janet, we've been holed up here for 2 weeks living on cafeteria crackers and rainwater. Maybe it's time we considered that we might need help." Marcus made a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd developed over the past 3 months. He knocked gently on the classroom door, his voice steady but non-threatening. "We're not raiders and we're not infected. We're just trying to find somewhere safe for the night." The conversation inside stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of weapons being readied. After a long moment, the door opened slightly, revealing a woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her clothes suggested she had been a teacher before the outbreak, and her eyes held the same haunted look that Marcus recognized in every survivor he'd encountered. "Names?" she demanded, keeping a hunting rifle trained on Marcus's chest while her gaze flicked nervously between him and Rebecca. "And prove the baby isn't infected." "I'm Marcus Rodriguez. This is Rebecca Thompson and her daughter Emma," Marcus replied, slowly setting his spear on the ground to show peaceful intentions. "The baby was born after the outbreak started. She's never been exposed to infected blood or bites." Behind the teacher, 2 other figures emerged from the shadows. A heavy-set man wearing a security guard uniform stepped forward with a baseball bat, while a teenager with bleached hair and multiple piercings clutched a kitchen knife with obvious inexperience. The unlikely trio had clearly been surviving through a combination of caution and sheer luck. "I'm Janet Mills," the teacher said, lowering her rifle slightly. "This is Detective Williams and Casey, one of my former students. We've been trying to reach the evacuation center, but the main roads are completely overrun." Detective Williams studied Marcus with the practiced eye of someone trained to read people's intentions. His security guard uniform was actually borrowed clothing, Marcus realized, noting the way the man carried himself with law enforcement authority despite the ill-fitting shirt. "What's your plan?" Because wandering around with a baby in tow isn't exactly a long-term survival strategy. Before Marcus could answer, the distinctive moan of zombies echoed through the hallway behind them. The front door they had carefully closed was now standing open, and shambling figures were filing through the entrance with the relentless hunger that had driven them to follow the scent of living flesh. "Barricade now," Detective Williams shouted, abandoning all pretense of distrust as survival instincts took over. Janet spun around to secure the classroom's back exit while Casey grabbed desks to stack against the door. Marcus retrieved his spear and positioned himself at the narrow choke point, while Rebecca found a corner where she could protect Emma while staying out of the line of combat. The first zombie reached their position just as Detective Williams brought his baseball bat down with the precision of someone who had learned to make every swing count. Janet's rifle cracked once, twice, dropping 2 more infected as they crowded through the doorway. Marcus's construction experience proved invaluable as he used his spear's reach to keep the undead at bay while the others repositioned themselves for maximum effectiveness. In those terrifying minutes of coordinated defense, 5 strangers became a team bound by necessity and mutual dependence. The question of trust had been answered not through words but through actions, as each person proved their commitment to group survival over individual safety. The crackling radio transmission cut through the morning silence like a lifeline thrown to drowning souls. Detective Williams adjusted the frequency on the emergency radio he'd salvaged from his patrol car, his weathered hands trembling slightly as the static cleared to reveal a robotic voice repeating coordinates and instructions. "Attention survivors, government safe zone established at Peterson Air Force Base, Colorado Springs. Military escort available at designated rally points. Repeat, Peterson Air Force Base is secure and operational. Janet looked up from the map she'd spread across the cafeteria table, her teacher's instincts automatically calculating distances and obstacles. "That's 60 miles south of here through some of the most densely populated areas in the state," she said, tracing potential routes with her finger. "We'd have to cross through downtown Denver and navigate the suburban sprawl where thousands of people try to evacuate." Marcus bounced Emma gently in his arms while Rebecca examined their dwindling supply of formula and medical supplies. The baby had become the group's unofficial mascot and primary motivation for finding long-term safety. Every decision now carried the weight of protecting the most vulnerable member of their makeshift family. "The broadcast mentioned rally points," Casey said, looking up from sharpening kitchen knives they'd collected from the school's cafeteria. At 17, the teenager had adapted to their harsh reality with the resilience that only youth could provide, but Marcus could see the toll that constant vigilance was taking on someone who should have been worried about college applications instead of zombie apocalypse survival. Detective Williams folded the radio's antenna and leaned back in his plastic chair. "I've been a cop for 15 years and I've seen how these emergency protocols work. Rally points usually mean other survivors, which could be good or bad depending on how desperate people have become." His experience in law enforcement had taught him that crisis situations often revealed the worst aspects of human nature alongside the best. The debate continued through the morning as they weighed their options. Stay in the relative security of the school with limited resources, or risk everything on the promise of military protection that might not exist. Rebecca's medical training made her acutely aware of Emma's needs, while Marcus's construction background helped him assess the structural integrity of potential shelter points along their route. Their decision was made for them when another group of survivors appeared at the school's entrance around noon. Through the boarded windows, they watched as 6 people approached the building, led by a woman in military fatigues carrying an assault rifle. The newcomers moved with practiced coordination that suggested either military training or extensive combat experience with the infected. "That's Lieutenant Anderson," Detective Williams said, recognizing the woman through his binoculars. "She was stationed at Buckley Air Force Base before the outbreak. If anyone would know about government safe zones, it would be her." The meeting that followed challenged everything they thought they knew about their situation. Lieutenant Sarah Anderson and her group had been traveling between survivor settlements, gathering intelligence and trying to establish communication networks. Her news was both encouraging and terrifying. "Peterson is real, but it's not what the broadcasts make it sound like," Anderson explained, accepting a cup of the precious coffee they'd been rationing. "The base is secure, but they're operating at capacity. They're only accepting essential personnel and their immediate families. Everyone else gets processed through screening camps that are basically refugee settlements with minimal resources." Her companion, a grizzled man named Tom Bradley who claimed to be a former park ranger, spread out a hand-drawn map showing confirmed zombie population densities between Denver and Colorado Springs. "The suburban areas are the worst," he said, pointing to red-marked zones. "Families tried to evacuate together, got trapped in traffic, and now those areas are dense with infected. The highways are graveyards." Casey's face fell as the reality of their situation became clear. "So we risk our lives to get to a place that might not even take us in?" Anderson nodded grimly. "But there are other options. We've been working with a network of settlements that are trying to establish independent safe zones. Smaller communities that are more flexible about who they accept, but also more vulnerable to large-scale attacks." The moral dilemma that emerged split the group down ideological lines. Rebecca argued passionately for seeking official government protection for Emma's sake, while Janet favored the community-based approach that reminded her of the collaborative spirit she'd fostered in her classroom. Marcus found himself torn between the practical benefits of military security and his construction workers' appreciation for grassroots problem-solving. Detective Williams posed the question that none of them wanted to face. "What if we get to Peterson and they turn us away? Do we have enough supplies to make it back here, or to one of these other settlements Anderson mentioned?" As afternoon shadows lengthened across the school's playground, they realized that their next decision would determine not just their immediate survival, but the kind of future they were willing to fight for. The promise of safety had revealed itself to be more complex than any of them had imagined, forcing them to confront fundamental questions about trust, community, and what it truly meant to rebuild civilization from the ashes of the old world. The decision to travel with Lieutenant Anderson's group had seemed logical at the time, but 3 days into their journey toward the Peterson Air Force Base, Marcus began to notice troubling changes in their new companions. Tom Bradley, the supposed park ranger, kept disappearing during rest stops to scout ahead, always returning with convenient excuses about zombie movements that couldn't be verified. More concerning was the way Anderson's other team members exchanged meaningful glances when they thought no one was watching, their military discipline gradually giving way to something that felt more like barely contained desperation. Food had become the unspoken tension that threatened to tear their expanded group apart. The combined supplies that had seemed adequate for the journey were disappearing faster than anyone had calculated, and Emma's formula was running dangerously low despite Rebecca's careful rationing. Detective Williams had begun conducting informal inventories during his watch shifts, discovering discrepancies that suggested someone was hoarding supplies or consuming more than their agreed-upon share. "We need to talk," Janet whispered to Marcus during the pre-dawn hours as they sheltered in an abandoned gas station outside Littleton. Her teacher's intuition had picked up on the same subtle signals that were making Marcus increasingly uncomfortable about their traveling companions. "Something's not right about Anderson's people. They're too familiar with this route, like they've made this trip before." Casey, who had been assigned to help Tom Bradley with perimeter security, confirmed their suspicions with disturbing news. "I overheard him talking on a radio last night," the teenager reported, glancing nervously toward where Bradley was supposedly keeping watch. "He was giving our location and talking about the package being delivered on schedule. When he saw me listening, he said it was just a check-in with Peterson, but the voice on the other end didn't sound military." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. In his construction career, he'd dealt with enough dishonest contractors to recognize the signs of betrayal, but he'd hoped that the shared struggle for survival would override such base motivations. The reality was far more complex and dangerous than he'd imagined. Rebecca clutched Emma closer as the implications became clear. "You think they're planning to trade us for something? Supplies? Safe passage?" Her nursing experience had exposed her to the worst aspects of human desperation in hospital emergency rooms, but even she had underestimated how quickly people could abandon moral principles when their own survival was at stake. Detective Williams confirmed their worst fears when he returned from investigating strange tracks near their position. "There's a camp about 2 miles east of here," he reported grimly. "Fresh tire marks, recent campfires, and evidence of at least a dozen people. This isn't a coincidence. We've been herded here deliberately." The confrontation came at dawn when Anderson announced a change in their route that would take them directly toward the mysterious camp Williams had discovered. Her justification was thin: claims about zombie herds blocking the main highway that contradicted the intelligence she'd shared just days earlier. When Marcus questioned the decision, Anderson's hand drifted toward her weapon with practiced casualness that spoke volumes about her true intentions. "Here's what's going to happen," Anderson said, dropping all pretense of cooperation as her team surrounded Marcus's group with weapons drawn. "You're going to come with us quietly and everyone stays safe. Make this difficult and the baby suffers first." The betrayal was swift and devastating. Tom Bradley had indeed been scouting their route, but not for zombies. He'd been coordinating with a larger group of survivors who had turned to trading human captives for supplies and territory. Anderson's military background was real, but her discharge had been less than honorable, and her survival strategy involved exploiting the trust of other survivors. In the chaos that followed, Detective Williams managed to create enough distraction for Casey to escape with specific instructions to find Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, a legitimate military contact Anderson had mentioned during their earlier conversations. The teenager's youth and size allowed navigation through terrain that would have been impossible for the adults, carrying with them the slim hope of rescue. Marcus, Rebecca, and Emma found themselves prisoners in a camp that operated like a twisted marketplace where human lives were currency and moral considerations were luxuries that the leaders claimed they couldn't afford. Janet's teaching background made her valuable as a caretaker for other captured children, while Marcus's construction skills were immediately put to work improving the camp's defenses against zombie attacks. The experience shattered their faith in random survivor alliances, but it also revealed the depth of their commitment to protecting each other. Even separated and under guard, they began planning their escape while learning valuable lessons about the different ways that civilization's collapse had affected the people trying to survive in its aftermath. The betrayal had cost them dearly, but it had also taught them that their small group's loyalty to each other was more valuable than any promise of safety from strangers who viewed other survivors as resources to be exploited rather than fellow human beings deserving of basic dignity and respect. Casey's legs burned with exhaustion as the teenager stumbled through the pre-dawn darkness, following the faint trail that Detective Williams had described during their brief escape plan. The weight of responsibility felt crushing for someone who should have been worried about prom dates instead of coordinating rescue missions. But the image of Emma's innocent face kept pushing Casey forward through terrain that seemed designed to break both body and spirit. The abandoned subway entrance appeared exactly where Williams had predicted, hidden beneath overgrown vegetation and camouflaged with debris that suggested deliberate concealment rather than natural decay. Casey's heart pounded as footsteps echoed from the tunnel depths, accompanied by the beam of a flashlight that could belong to either salvation or another trap. "Password," came a gruff voice from the shadows, followed by the unmistakable sound of a rifle being chambered. The voice carried military authority but lacked the predatory edge that Casey had learned to associate with the raiders who had captured their friends. "Detective Williams sent me," Casey called out, remembering the specific phrase Williams had whispered during their escape. "He said to tell you that the blue line still runs on time, and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes owes him $20 from poker night." The flashlight beam lowered, and a figure emerged from the tunnel wearing genuine military fatigues that bore the insignia of the Colorado National Guard. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen stepped forward with the cautious professionalism of someone who had learned to verify everything twice in a world where deception could be fatal. "Williams is alive?" Chen asked, his weathered face showing the first genuine emotion Casey had seen from an adult in weeks. "We lost contact with his sector 3 months ago. Command assumed his unit had been overrun during the downtown evacuation." Casey quickly explained the situation, watching as Chen's expression darkened with each detail about Anderson's betrayal and the human trafficking operation. The sergeant's radio crackled to life as he transmitted coded messages that brought immediate responses from multiple stations throughout the underground network. "What you've described changes everything," Chen said, leading Casey deeper into the tunnel system that had been transformed into a sophisticated command center. Emergency lighting illuminated maps, communication equipment, and weapons caches that spoke of serious military organization rather than the desperate improvisation Casey had become accustomed to seeing. The underground facility revealed itself to be far more extensive than Casey had imagined. Lieutenant Colonel James Hayes emerged from a side chamber, his silver hair and lined face showing the strain of command during impossible circumstances. Behind him came Dr. Patricia Morgan, a CDC researcher whose presence suggested that the military's understanding of the zombie outbreak was more advanced than the surface survivors realized. "We've been tracking Anderson's operation for weeks," Hayes explained, spreading reconnaissance photos across a metal table. "She's part of a larger network that's been exploiting the chaos to establish illegal settlements based on forced labor and human trafficking. The problem is that they've been using legitimate military communications to maintain credibility with survivor groups." Dr. Morgan stepped forward with data that challenged everything Casey thought they knew about the infected. "Our research indicates that the zombie behavior patterns are more complex than initial reports suggested. They're not just mindless predators. There's evidence of pack coordination and territorial behavior that suggests residual brain function in certain areas." The revelation was both terrifying and hopeful. If the zombies retained some cognitive abilities, it meant they could potentially be studied, understood, and possibly even treated. However, it also meant that the infected posed a more intelligent threat than anyone had prepared for. Casey absorbed this information while Hayes outlined the rescue plan for Marcus, Rebecca, Emma, Janet, and Detective Williams. The operation would involve coordinating with other underground cells throughout the Denver metro area, using the subway tunnels as hidden highways to move personnel and equipment without attracting zombie attention or alerting the raider camps to military presence. "The trafficking operation has been using our people as forced labor to build fortifications against zombie attacks," Hayes continued, pointing to surveillance photos that showed Marcus working on construction projects under armed guard. "They're essentially using human slaves to create defensive positions that they plan to trade to other survivor groups for supplies and territory." Sergeant Chin introduced Casey to the other members of the underground network, former teachers, mechanics, doctors, and soldiers who had formed a shadow government dedicated to protecting legitimate survivors while gathering intelligence about both zombie behavior and human exploitation. Their methodical approach to resistance stood in stark contrast to the desperate improvisation that had characterized Casey's recent experiences. As plans took shape for the rescue operation, Casey realized that their small group's capture had inadvertently connected them to a much larger movement dedicated to rebuilding civilization according to principles of justice and human dignity. The underground network represented hope that organized resistance was possible, even in a world where traditional authority structures had collapsed and moral compromise seemed like the only path to survival. The rescue mission had been executed with military precision, but the celebration was short-lived as Dr. Morgan's worst fears about zombie evolution were confirmed during their escape from the raider camp. Marcus carried Emma while helping Rebecca navigate the underground tunnels, but their relief at being reunited was overshadowed by Detective Williams' disturbing report about what he'd observed during their captivity. "They're learning," Williams said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls as Lieutenant Colonel Hayes led them deeper into the network's main facility. The infected that attacked the camp weren't just wandering through randomly. They coordinated their approach, used the guard towers as vantage points, and seemed to understand that the electric fence had weak points. Dr. Morgan stopped walking, her face pale in the emergency lighting. She had spent months analyzing tissue samples and behavioral reports, but hearing first-hand accounts of tactical zombie behavior confirmed her most troubling research findings. "How many were in the group that attacked?" "At least 20, Janet replied, clutching Casey's arm as they walked. Her teacher's eye for detail had noted patterns that others might have missed. "But here's what scared me most. They didn't all attack at once. Some stayed back and observed, like they were learning from watching the others engage with the camp's defenses." Sergeant Chin exchanged worried glances with Hayes as they reached the command center. The walls were covered with new intelligence reports that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of zombie adaptation throughout the Denver metro area. Red pins on the map showed locations where coordinated attacks had been reported, while blue pins marked areas where the infected seemed to be establishing territorial boundaries. "Show them the footage from Sector 7, Hayes instructed as Chin activated a monitor displaying grainy surveillance video from a camera mounted on a highway overpass. The black and white images showed dozens of zombies moving through an abandoned shopping mall with what could only be described as organized formation patterns. Marcus watched in horror as the infected creatures demonstrated problem-solving abilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about their capabilities. When they encountered a barricaded storefront, several zombies worked together to move debris while others stood guard, displaying a level of cooperation that suggested retained cognitive function. "The virus isn't just reanimating dead tissue," Dr. Morgan explained, pulling up medical charts that showed brain scan comparisons. "It's selectively preserving certain neural pathways while destroying others. The areas responsible for higher reasoning are damaged, but the sections that control pack hunting, territorial behavior, and basic tool use remain partially functional." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground facility's temperature. As a nurse, she understood the implications of what Dr. Morgan was describing. "You're saying they're not getting smarter, but they're accessing survival instincts that humans developed over millions of years of evolution?" "Exactly," Dr. Morgan confirmed. "And those instincts are being refined through experience. Each encounter with human survivors teaches them more effective hunting strategies. The infected that survive combat situations are essentially training the others through some form of behavioral mimicry." The revelation forced them to reconsider every aspect of their survival strategy. The weapons and tactics that had worked during the early days of the outbreak were becoming less effective as the zombie population adapted to human defensive patterns. Hayes spread out plans for upgraded equipment that his network had been developing in response to these evolving threats. "We've been working on sonic disruption devices that interfere with whatever mechanism they're using to coordinate," Hayes explained, showing them prototypes that looked like modified emergency radios. "Field tests suggest that certain frequencies can break up their pack formations, but the effect is temporary." Casey studied the technical diagrams with the quick learning ability that had helped survive the past months. "What about their weaknesses? If they're getting smarter about attacking, maybe they're also developing new vulnerabilities?" Dr. Morgan nodded approvingly at the teenager's insight. "That's exactly what we're hoping to discover. Initial observations suggest that their enhanced pack behavior comes at the cost of individual initiative. Separated from the group, they seem to revert to more basic shambling patterns." The discussion continued late into the night as they developed new protocols for dealing with evolved zombie threats. Marcus's construction experience proved valuable in designing modular barricades that could be quickly reconfigured to counter adaptive attack patterns, while Janet's teaching background helped create training programs for other survivors who would need to learn these new defensive techniques. As they prepared for sleep in the secure underground facility, each member of the group grappled with the unsettling realization that their enemy was no longer the mindless horde they had initially faced. The infected were becoming more dangerous with each passing day, forcing the survivors to evolve their own strategies or risk being overwhelmed by an adversary that learned from every encounter. The war between the living and the undead had entered a new phase, where intelligence and adaptation would determine which species would ultimately inherit the earth. The war room beneath Denver streets hummed with coordinated activity as Lieutenant Colonel Hayes unveiled Operation Reclaim Dawn, the most ambitious survivor mission attempted since the outbreak began. 3 weeks of intelligence gathering had identified critical infrastructure points throughout the metro area where coordinated strikes could establish permanent safe zones while disrupting the evolved zombie pack territories that Dr. Morgan's research had mapped. Marcus stood before a scale model of downtown Denver, his construction expertise invaluable in identifying which buildings could serve as defensible strongholds and which structures needed to be demolished to create effective fire lanes. His calloused hands traced potential routes between objectives while his mind calculated the engineering challenges of fortifying urban positions against an enemy that had learned to exploit architectural weaknesses. The key is simultaneous strikes, Hayes explained, pointing to red markers that indicated primary targets. We hit the Central Library, the Convention Center, and Union Station at exactly the same time. These locations give us high ground, multiple escape routes, and the structural integrity to withstand prolonged siege situations. Rebecca adjusted Emma in her arms while studying medical supply caches that would need to be established at each location. Her nursing background had evolved into field medic expertise, and she understood that casualties were inevitable in an operation of this scope. What about the evolved packs we've been tracking? Dr. Morgan's data shows they've established territorial boundaries around most of these targets. Dr. Morgan stepped forward with updated intelligence that had arrived just hours earlier. The sonic disruption devices are more effective than we initially hoped, but they have limited battery life and range. Each strike team will have approximately 15 minutes of coordinated disruption before the infected adapt to our frequency patterns and re-establish pack cohesion. Detective Williams had been selected to lead the Union Station assault team, his law enforcement experience complemented by months of survival combat that had hardened him into an effective tactical commander. 15 minutes isn't long enough to clear and secure a facility that size, he said, studying blueprints that showed the station's complex layout. We'll need to identify choke points where small teams can hold defensive positions while the main force establishes the command center. Casey had grown from frightened teenager into the network's most effective scout, capable of moving through zombie-infested territory with a combination of youthful agility and hard-earned survival instincts. I've been watching the pack movements around Union Station for a week, the teenager reported. They've established a patrol pattern that rotates every 6 hours. If we time the assault for their shift change, we might catch them during their most vulnerable reorganization period. Janet's teaching background had proven unexpectedly valuable in coordinating communication between assault teams. Her ability to break down complex plans into clear, actionable steps had become essential for ensuring that survivors with varying levels of combat experience could execute their roles effectively. We'll need backup communication methods in case the radio networks get compromised, she noted, referencing contingency plans that accounted for equipment failure or enemy interference. Sergeant Chin had spent days training volunteers in urban warfare tactics adapted specifically for fighting evolved zombies. The traditional military approaches needed modification to account for enemy behavior that combined animal pack instincts with residual human problem-solving abilities. Remember, these aren't the shambling corpses we faced during the first months, he reminded the assembled strike teams. They'll test our defenses, probe for weaknesses, and coordinate their attacks based on what they learn from initial contact. The first phase of Operation Reclaim Dawn launched at dawn on a Tuesday morning when meteorological conditions provided optimal visibility and wind patterns for the sonic disruption devices. Marcus led the engineering team that would secure the convention center, their mission complicated by the building's extensive glass facade that provided excellent sight lines but minimal protection from coordinated zombie assaults. The initial strikes exceeded all expectations as months of careful planning and evolved tactics proved superior to zombie adaptation. The sonic devices created chaos within the infected ranks, breaking up pack formations and reverting mini-zombies to individual shambling behavior that made them vulnerable to traditional elimination methods. Within 2 hours, all 3 primary objectives had been secured and preliminary fortifications were under construction. However, Dr. Morgan's fears about zombie learning capacity were confirmed when the surviving infected began adapting to the sonic disruption patterns faster than anticipated. By afternoon, new pack formations were emerging that demonstrated resistance to the frequency patterns, forcing the strike teams to implement backup strategies that relied more heavily on traditional combat methods and defensive positioning. As night fell over Denver, the human survivors had successfully established their first permanent strongholds in months, but they had also learned that their enemy's capacity for adaptation was even more formidable than they had imagined. The counterstrike had succeeded in reclaiming strategic territory, but it had also escalated the evolutionary arms race between human intelligence and zombie instinct to a new level that would determine the ultimate fate of both species. 6 months after the first coordinated strikes, the transformed skyline of Denver told a story of human resilience that Marcus could barely have imagined during those desperate early days hiding behind overturned trucks. From his position atop the fortified convention center, he watched the sunrise illuminate a city where the living had reclaimed not just territory but hope itself. The construction projects that now defined his daily routine involved building schools and hospitals rather than mere survival shelters. Emma had taken her first steps in the secured children's area that Rebecca had helped establish within the Central Library stronghold. At 18 months old, the baby represented something unprecedented in their post-outbreak world. A child who had never known fear of the infected, growing up in communities where zombie threats were managed rather than merely survived. Rebecca's nursing skills had evolved into coordinating medical services for a growing population of survivors who no longer lived day-to-day but planned for futures that extended beyond mere existence. The breakthrough had come when Dr. Morgan's research team discovered that the sonic disruption technology could be refined into permanent installations that created dead zones, where zombie pack coordination became impossible. These sonic barriers, powered by solar arrays that Marcus's construction teams had installed throughout the city, formed invisible walls that contained the infected populations in specific areas while allowing human settlement to expand safely. Detective Williams stood in what had once been Union Station, now transformed into the communication hub that connected Denver's survivor network with similar communities throughout Colorado and neighboring states. The radio chatter that filled the restored building carried reports of successful harvests, trade negotiations, and cultural events that marked humanity's gradual return to civilization. His law enforcement background had prepared him for maintaining order, but nothing had prepared him for the satisfaction of helping to create a society based on cooperation rather than mere survival. Casey, now 19 and serving as Director of Reconnaissance for the Regional Survivor Council, led teams of young scouts who mapped safe travel corridors between established settlements. The teenager who had once fled desperately through zombie-infested streets now commanded respect as someone whose intimate knowledge of infected behavior patterns had become essential for urban planning and expansion strategies. Janet's educational expertise had proved invaluable in establishing the Denver Learning Collective, a network of schools where children and adults alike learn not just traditional subjects but the specialized skills needed for thriving in their transformed world. Her classroom in the secured library taught everything from zombie behavior recognition to sustainable agriculture, preparing a generation that would never take civilization's benefits for granted. The final campaign against the concentrated zombie populations had required sacrifices that still weighed heavily on the survivors' hearts. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had died leading the assault on the infected stronghold in the old airport, but his tactical innovations had enabled the complete clearing of Denver's transportation infrastructure. Dr. Morgan had continued her research until the very end, her final breakthrough providing the technical specifications for sonic barriers that could be replicated by other survivor communities worldwide. As Marcus watched the morning traffic of bicycles, electric vehicles and horse-drawn carts moving through streets that had once been death traps, he reflected on how profoundly their understanding of strength and community had evolved. The construction projects that now occupied his time involved building memorials to those who had died defending their vision of renewed civilization, structures that honored sacrifice while celebrating the future that sacrifice had made possible. The zombie threat had not been eliminated entirely. Controlled populations of infected remained in designated containment zones, both for Dr. Morgan's continuing research into potential treatments and as a reminder of what humanity had overcome. But these controlled populations served the survivors rather than threatening them, providing opportunities for training new generations in defense techniques while maintaining the vigilance that their hard-won freedom required. Rebecca watched Emma play with other children in the secure courtyard garden, their laughter a sound that had once seemed impossible in their devastated world. The medical facilities she now supervised included not just trauma centers for treating combat injuries, but maternity wards where new life entered a world where hope had been restored through collective effort and unwavering determination. As the sun reached its zenith over the restored city, each member of their original group understood that they had become part of something larger than survival. They had helped prove that human civilization could adapt, evolve, and ultimately triumph even when faced with threats that seemed designed to destroy everything that made life worth living. The future stretching before them contained challenges that they could not yet imagine, but it also held the promise that those challenges would be met by communities strong enough to face any darkness and determined enough to always choose the dawn. Their story had become the foundation upon which a new chapter of human history would be written. One word, one day, one act of courage at a time. Chat controls Sonnet 4.